All right, Rabosai, good morning, good morning. Let's begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan. Thank Yanki and Eliza Statman and Yitzi and Rebecca Statman for dedicating all the shiurim and drushos this month in commemoration of the first yard site of their sister, Menucha Shendel Yehudis Zichron Levracha Bas David Yosef. To thank Shmuel Rabin Karabkin for dedicating all the shurim and drushos this month in commemoration of the 25th yard site of Rabin's mother, Melanie Solomon Pesa Mira Bas Chaim Zichron Levracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, thank you, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a nechama. With that, let us begin with a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Daf Vav. Daf Vav 6. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Daf Vav, second line down the Meisveh. So just to orient ourselves a little bit, we got into the very interesting sugya yesterday of what we call Yadayim She'inan Mochichos. Remember again, on Beis Amud Aleph in the Mishnah, we were introduced to the concept of three different, we'll call it categories of Nedarim. One of the categories we were introduced to is the concept of Yodos. Yodos means partial declarations, the ability to go ahead and make a partial statement and yet affect a neder. What we got into yesterday is how explicit, or we'll call how explicit, does a yad have to be? In other words, so does a yad, although a yad is truncated, does it have to be absolutely explicitly understood, or is there room even for ambiguity within a yad? So this is the machlokes that's called Yadayim Mochichos, Yadayim She'inan Mochichos. This is the machlokes we had yesterday between Abaye and Rava. Abaye held that halacha lamaisa Yadayim She'inan Mochichos, even an inexplicit yad will still affect an eder. Rava held Yadayim She'inan Mochichos lo havyon Yadayim. Ultimately, again, if the yad is ambiguous or inexplicit, ultimately, again, it will not affect a neder. That's the machlokes. And again, I will say, remember, we tried to line up this machlokes because it's going to come up again today. We tried to align this machlokes with the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon in Gittin. What was that machlokes? That was, interestingly enough, Rabbi Yehuda said that in a get, the Rabbanon said, in a get, all you need is what? Hari'at mutaris l'chol adam. That's all you need. The Rabbi Yehuda came along and said, no, that's not true. You need a lot more than that. You need to get to be able to say, Din havilechi minai sefer teruchin igeresh shvukin. You need to be much more explicit that it is through this get that we are dissolving this marriage. The Gemara wanted to align the machlokes Rabbanan Rabbi Yehuda with Abaye and Rava. What we ended off with yesterday was the Gemara saying, not necessarily. Not necessarily. Those two machloksim do not necessarily align because it could very well be that get is just a different type of subject. Good. Now, let us begin. Meisvei. So we'll say the Gemara is going to launch a series of questions really focused on Abaye, right? So remember again, Abaye's shita is Yadayim she'inon mochichos havyon Yadayim. So according to Abaye, even if you make an inexplicit, ambiguous yad, ultimately, again, that works. So we'll say, let's analyze. So Meisvei, second line down, Vav Amud Aleph, Meisvei, Hare hu alai, hare ze alai, Asar mipnei shuhu yad lekarban. So it was an interesting case. A person comes along and says, Hare hu alai, this is upon me. Or Hare ze alai, this is upon me. So both say, the Gemara says, quoting this price, the Gemara says that essentially a person has assered the object to themselves. Why? Because Rabbi say, this sounds like a yad lekarban. This sounds like a yad that you're making something like of sacrificial status, like a carbon. But say, take a look at Rashi. Well, actually, before I get to Rashi, I'm sorry, the Ran. So the Gemara says, Taima da amr alai. Now, the reason in this case that you've created an effective yad is why? Because you've used the word alai, upon me. So I'll say, when you use that lashon of alai upon me, so the Gemara seems to understand, it seems to be much more explicitly clear that you are answering something on yourself. However, avalo amar alai, lo. But if you did not go ahead and say alai, then ultimately, again, you would not create iser. The Rebbe say, so the Gemara says like this, and it's actually quite fascinating. The Gemara says, a person comes along and says, Harehu alai, this thing is upon me. So the Gemara seems to feel that's explicit. That would be yadayim mochichos. The fact that you could only create Isser with the word alai, but if alai were missing, you would not create Isser. If you didn't have alai, that essentially would be yadayim she'inan mochichos, an inexplicit or ambiguous yad. And yet the Gemara says that an inexplicit or ambiguous yad would not work. That is a contradiction to who? To Abaye. To Abaye. Pause here for just a moment. Let's take a look at the Ran. So the Ran in the widest lines, about 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines off from the bottom. So you see what the Ran says, Ran on the left side. Meisei harehu alai, taima da amr alai, hu da asr, avalo amr lo. The afagav, dibalo alai, vadayad miha havi. So Rabbi said, what's interesting, see the Gemara is operating with the understanding over here that this lashon of harehu or hare zeh is yad. See, I would say we haven't fully gotten into this yet because what I'll point out to you, something interesting, is if you've noticed, we've spoken about the concept of a yad. What we have not delved into is what? Like the lashonos of a yad. But it's interesting, a lot of this is coming out now. Again, we will delve into, we started the Mishnah a little bit, but the lashon of harehu, right? A person says about an object, this, harehu, hare, or hare zeh, right? Hare zeh. So that's lashon of a yad. It's lashon of a yad. That's a partial neder. So the Gemara says the only reason, the Rice is indicating, the only reason it works, the Ran says, I'm sorry, we'll go on to the Ran because the next part of the Gemara, but harehu by itself is, let me go back. Harehu alai is yadayim mochichos. That's an explicit yad. This object is upon me. It is clear that although you're using a truncated, shortened form of neder verbiage, you're making something asr upon yourself. Harehu would be a yadayim she'inal mochichos, ambiguous yad. And the Bryce is telling me that halacha l'maisa, it doesn't work, which is a refutation of the position of Abaye. Good. To which the Gemara says, Abaye says, no. Taima da amr alayhu da aser, aval amr harehu velo amr alay, harehu de hefker, harehu de tzedakah ka'amar. So Abaye says, this case has nothing to do with yadayim she'inan mochichos. This is something different. Abaye says, the problem with the lashon of harehu or hare zeh without the modifier of alay is that it's not clear at all what your intention is. And it could be just as likely that what? You're making the item hefker or you're dedicating the item to tzedakah, which is really quite interesting. So Abaye is saying this is not a case of yadayim she'inan mochichos, because yadayim she'inan mochichos, an ambiguous or inexplicit neder will absolutely work. The problem here is that the lashon could have a dramatically different connotation. A person is speaking about an object and he says hare zeh what? Hare zeh what? Baby saying hare zeh hefker, hare zeh tzedakah, right? It's only once you go ahead and you add in the alai that lamaisa we understand that he's making a neder. Otherwise, again, he could be using a totally different construct. Go back to the Ran for just a moment. That same Ran. It's now 2, 4, 6, 7 lines from the bottom. Umishaninon v'dilma harihu hefker ka'amar. Kolomar dibalo alai afilu yad she'ena mochiach lo havi le'isser. See, I will say what Abai is answering is like this: without a lie, this isn't even a yad, right? Without a lie, this isn't even a yad. Mishum dibiyad eno ela ba'alai damar hare ze'alai v'i masik dibure va'amar hare alai aser. So I will say, in order for a neder to be affected, there has to at least be some relationship created between the vower and the object. Right? If there's no relationship between the vower and the object, so Abaye posits there might not even be a neder over here. So if you have an object and you say hare zeh, okay, hare zeh what? Hare zeh what? In other words, let's say hare zeh can be hare zeh hefker. I'm making this hefker. Hare zeh tzedakah. I'm pledging this to tzedakah. Right? It doesn't mean a neder. Only once you create the relationship between yourself and the object, ultimately is there a neder. So Rabbi say, Abaye therefore says, this is not at all a contradiction to my position because this case represents a secondary issue. Incredible. So the Gemara says, "V'hamipnei shuyad lekarbon katani." Here's the only problem, Rabbi say. If you go back, keep your finger on this place over here, but if you go back to the second line on Vav Amud Aleph, right, when the Gemara quotes the Brisa, what did the Brisa say? The Brisa said, "Harehu alai, harei ze alai, aser mipnei shuyad lekarbon." So we'll say, that's not what the Brisa is saying. The Brisa says that when you say the lashon of harei ze alai, it says it's a yad for a carbon. So it seeming indicate to us that we are dealing with a case of yados. To which the Gemara says, Ela ima, it's quite interesting, Ela ima, taima da amar alai hu aser v'chavera mutter. So we'll say, very interesting idea over here. The Gemara says, rather, the reason is like this. When you say alai, when you use the lashon of alai, ultimately, what does alai do? Alai says that I, the devour, am aser, but my friend, I don't know, Zabos say, let's say again, I'm making someone, my object aser onto someone, or ultimately someone else's object aser onto me. Alai only creates a one-sided iser, right? V'chaver muter. Aval amar harehu shnehen asurin. Very interesting, Rabbi saying. It's only in a case of where a person says hare alai that the vower is creating a one-sided iser. But if you say harehu could potentially create double-sided iser. Why, Rabbi say? Because when you make a lashon of harehu, it's possible that what? What are you making the object? You're making the object hekdish. And when you make an object hekdish, Rabbi say, who does it become asr to? Who does it become asr to? To everyone. So we'll say, take a look at the Ran for just a moment. Actually, take a look at the Ran for just a moment. 4 lines up from the bottom. Ela ema taima damra alai aval amar harehu shneim asurin mishum dechevan she'in mochichos havyan yadayim islam leminkat lechumra v'doma harehu hektish kamer. So we'll say, Gemara says like this. In reality, the take-home message of this brisa is something a little bit different. This isn't really about yadayim mochichos or yadayim she'in mochichos. This is teaching us like this. I go over to an object, my object, and I say, Harei ze alai. So Harei ze alai, what the Mishnah is teaching me is, what does that do? What does that do? That creates prohibition, legabe me. I've made a neder, and now I've prohibited that object to me. And we'll say, is it usher to anyone else? Usher to anyone else? No. Why? Because I used the lashon of alai, as opposed to, if I didn't use alai, and I just said Harei hu, or Harei ze, and we'll say, what happens in that case? In that case, we have to treat the object like hekdish. And because it's like hekdish, therefore, who does it become asr to? All parties involved. Amar harehu shnein asurin the dilma harihu hekdish karin. I will say, but I want to point out something very interesting. If you notice over here, now remember, if I say harehu or harezeh, am I definitively making this hekdish? Am I making hekdish? Remember, no. The problem over here is we don't know what's going on. We don't know what's going on. So out of suffix, we have to be machmir. And they're both say, go back to that Ran for just a moment. The Ran says again, he says, Mishum dechevan she'en mochichos havyin yadayim islam leminkat lechumra. Now remember, both say, if anything, it's so funny that, it's not so funny, but it's so interesting, that the Gemara's attempt to bring this brisa as a question on Abaye actually turns out to be a support to Abaye, right? And in fact, ultimately, again, what the Gemara is saying is like this, is that halacha l'maisa, that this is a case of yadayim she'enan mochichos, of inexplicit or ambiguous yad, and in fact, it works. It works. That halacha l'maisa, if he just says harehu or harei alai, I would have to ask for the object to all parties involved, ultimately, again, because of the possibility that he's made it hekdish. Okay, good. So therefore, I will say, bottom line, no contradiction on Abaye. Right? That's the takeaway from this. Meisvei. The Gemara goes weiter. Harezu chatos, harezu asham. So what's another case? Right? I say, this animal is a chatos, this animal is an asham. We'll say a very interesting case here. So watch this. Afapi, shuchayim chatos va'asham, lo amar klum. The Rebbe said, now watch this. Here's the case. Let's do the following situation. Let's say I happen to be chayiv v'chatos, right? I accidentally ate a piece of non-kosher food, right? So now I'm chayiv v'chatos. Okay. So we'll say, so now watch this case. Now I go ahead and I say I am chayiv b'chatos. Harei zu chatos. I go over to an animal. I say this animal is a chatos. This animal is an asham. So what's the halacha? Afa pishu chayiv chatos v'asham. Even though Rabbi says I just mentioned I happen to be chayiv a chatos or an asham. What's the halacha? Lo amar klum. Ultimately, my statement is meaningless. My statement is meaningless. Right? Rabbi say, now what's the reason? If you take a look again at the Ran, 3 lines up from the bottom, the Ran says, Harei zu chatos, v'afa pishu mechuyiv chatos v'asham, lo amar klum, she'ein chatos ba'a nidava. Rabbi say, this is fascinating. This is fascinating. You see, in this case over here, I'm just making a general statement, right? This animal should be a chatos, this animal should be an asham. So Rabbi say, the way that statement is looked at in halacha is how? That I am voluntarily committing myself to bring a chatas or an asham. Are you allowed to voluntarily commit yourself to bring a chatas or an asham? No. Therefore, again, the statement is absolutely meaningless. However, harei zu chatasi, harei zu ashami. But if I say about the animal, this is my chatas, this is my asham, im hayamuchuyav. If ultimately again I was chayiv a chatas or an asham, dvarav kayamin. Ultimately, again, it works. It works. To which the Gemara says, to yufta da Abaye. Rabbi say this effectively refutes the position of Abaye. Rabbi say, why does this refute the position of Abaye? Remember, Rabbi say, let's go back. What does Abaye hold? What does Abaye hold? Abaye holds yadayim she'enon mochichos havyon yadayim. Right, that even an inexplicit, ambiguous yad has the ability to go ahead and affect a neder. So Rabbi say, let's play this out. I'm chayiv a chatas or an asham. I'm chayiv a chatas, right? I go over to an animal and I say, harei zu chatas. Harei zu chatas. Right? So the Gemara says, so now, should that work according to Abaye? Should that work? Yes. Why? Because that's a yad, and it's ein mochiach. It's ambiguous. Why is it ambiguous? Because I'm not explicitly articulating that it should be my chatas, right? But it's close enough. Again, it's a yad, it's a partial declaration, right? It's inexplicit, it's ambiguous, but Abaye says that an inexplicit, ambiguous yad should work. If that's the case, I will say, so again, I want to be clear. Everyone agrees with the halachic premise that you cannot commit yourself to bring a chatas or an asham if you're not chayiv. We established that in yesterday's daf already, which makes sense. These are karbanos that come for kapara, that come for atonement. If you're not chayiv, you can't bring it. But one second. If I'm chayiv b'chatas, I get it. The explicit formulation is harei zu chatasi. This is my chatas. Okay, so I didn't use the explicit formulation. That's fine. But I said harei zu chatas. That's at least a yad she'eno muchach. That's at least, all right, it's an ambiguous yad. According to Abaye, that should work. But the Bryce indicates that what? That it doesn't work. So we'll say this is a refutation of the position of Abaye. To which the Gemara says, we'll say incredible. To which the Gemara says, Abaye says, no. Hamani Rabbi Hudahi. Now don't get all worked up. That reflects the position of Rabbi Huda. Oh, okay. They both say, which Rabbi Huda? Rabbi Huda in Gittin, like we saw in yesterday's daf. I will say Rabbi Huda in Gittin. Remember, what did Rabbi Huda say in Gittin? Rabbi Huda is one who said in Gittin that it's not enough just to say what? Right, Hari'at mutaris l'chol adam. Rather, what do you need? You need to be able to say that this get is a sefer teruchin, geresh shvukin. You need to write all of these things that explicitly say that halacha l'maisa, the get dissolves the marriage. Abaye says, this price is not a contradiction on me. This price reflects the view of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds yadayim she'enan mochichos lo havyon yadayim, and therefore again, until you explicitly say harei zu chatasi and are also chayev achatas, ultimately the declaration will not work. I will say incredible. I will say it is beautiful to see. By the way, we're only at the beginning of Nedarim. I was saying to someone in the Chavri yesterday, 2 incredible things about Nedarim. Number one, how every daf ends perfectly, right? If you notice again, like every daf ends exactly where it's supposed to end at the end of the page, right beginning of the next one. And also how really all of the sugyas flow beautifully, seamlessly, one into the other. It requires a little bit of chazara just to kind of stay on track. But Lamai says such a seamless flow. So remember again, Abaye is saying like this, you're bringing this brisa as a contradiction to me. Remember again, I'll say one more time, because let's get this clear. One more time. So the brisa is saying, I'm chai v'chatas. I go over to the animal. I say, Harezu chatasi. What's the halacha? Harezu chatasi works, right? Why? Why does it work? Why wouldn't it work? It's explicit. I'm chayiv b'chatas. I'm saying this is my chatas. Good. What's the shayla? I say harezu chatas. Harezu chatas. Oh, now the Brisa says doesn't work. Doesn't work. To which says, really? So Abaye, this is a problem for you because harezu chatas is a yad she'eno mochiach or she'eno muchach, right? An inexplicit partial declaration for a neder. And yet, according to Abaye, that should work. The Brisa says it doesn't work. Kasha on Abaye. Abaye says, not a kasha on me. This reflects the view of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds yadayim she'enon mochichos lo havion yadayim. Now both say, did Rabbi Yehuda ever say the words yadayim she'enon mochichos lo havion yadayim? Did he ever say those words? No. Because the truth is, to be fair, Rabbi Yehuda is not talking about Nedarim. Rabbi Yehuda is talking about gittin, right? He's talking about that a get, it's a Yiddish get, right? A get needs to be explicit, right? A get needs to be explicit. A get can't just say, Hare'at mutaris l'chol adam. It needs to have all of these other lashonos, which explicitly indicate that the get is dissolving the marriage. So we glean from that Rabbi Yehuda holds, Yadayim she'enon mochichos lo havyon yadayim. So Rabbi says, this price says according to Rabbi Yehuda, not according to me. Abba say, which by the way is okay. Not every brisa goes according to every single opinion. Beautiful. But here's the problem. Say, Yehuda Amar Ana Da'ami Afil Rabbi Yehuda. So I'll say, here's the problem. How did we end off yesterday's daf? I will say, if you remember again, the Gemara wanted to suggest that the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan by Gittin aligns with Abaye and Rava, or I should say, Abaye and Rava align with Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan. That Abaye, who doesn't require Yadayim Mochichos, would hold like the Rabbanan, and Rava would hold like Rabbi Yehuda. But if you're going to say, then what happened? Abaye said, not true. I could even hold like Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Because Rabbi Yehuda only needed explosivity, right? Explicitness. When? By Gittin. But it could be in Nedarim, he would even agree Yadayim Sherichos Abaye. Now you're saying the Brisa holds like Rabbi Yehuda, but you were the one who said in yesterday's daf that you even agree with Rabbi Yehuda, and maybe even by Gittin, Rabbi Yehuda would agree with you. To which the Gemara says, Haderbei. Oh yeah, that Rabbi Yehuda, he recanted that. He retracted that, right? Whereas he walked that back. That halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Yehuda Abaye came to see that Rabbi Yehuda's position in Gittin was really not simply a unique position in Gittin, but really represented a greater view about Yadayim she'enon mochichos lo havyon Yadayim. Fascinating. So he walked it back. So I will say, by the way, I'll just point out something very interesting. This idea of like Haderbei and the fact that the Gemara records this, I will say, such a profound yesod. Because what does it teach us? It's okay to change your mind. And it's okay to change your approach. And it's okay to change your hashkafas about things. And it's okay to change your outlooks. You know, sometimes we become so rooted in something that we feel that like this is the life outlook, this is the approach, this is the lifestyle, this is the hashkafa that I'm tethered to. I've invested in it. And by the way, sometimes that's a good thing when it's the right life outlook and the right lifestyle and the right hashkafa. Sometimes it's bad when it's not the right things for me. And we think that we're so, tethered to something, rooted in something that we can't change it. Let's say two words the Gemara says, Haderbei. We just spent, there's like a half a page of Gemara devoted to that, right? To Rabbi Yehuda to Abaye showing that he could hold the Gemara Rabbi Yehuda. Yeah, he said it, and then what happened? He changed his mind. Haderbei. It's okay to change your mind. It's okay people are going to look at me strange. Maybe, but at the end of the day, if I know that the way I look at things is wrong, if I know that my lifestyle is wrong, if I know that what I'm doing is wrong, L'maisa, again, find the courage to walk it back. It's a little bit awkward. Okay, it's a little bit awkward for just a couple of moments, but then Amir Hashem, you set yourself on the right path going forward. Haderbei, two simple words, just like a bumper sticker. Haderbei. Ella, Leima Rava Damak Rabbi Yehuda. But one second, if that's the case, Rabbi say, so now what are we saying? So now, if Abaye no longer goes ahead and holds like Rabbi Yehuda, then Rabbi say, so now what we're saying is Abaye holds like the Rabbanan. That means that Rava holds like Rabbi Yehuda. Now, Bosai, Now remember again, in yesterday's daf, Rava felt that his opinion could even be in conformance with the Rabbanon. So Amar Lecha Rava, no. Anna, so remember again, Rava holds, Yadayim she'enon mochichos, lo havyon yadayim. Lo havyon yadayim. Initially or reflexively, we wanted to align Rava with Rabbi Yehuda. Right? So now that we're saying that Abaye aligns himself with the Rabbanon, not like Rabbi Yehuda, does that ultimately just peg Rava with Rabbi Yehuda? To which the Gemara says, quoting from yesterday's daf, Rava says, no. Ana da Amri, I feel the Rabbanon. Rava says, no. Rabbi, Abaye's problem is Abaye's problem. Me, I hold that my position is really in alignment with the Rabbanon as well. Why? Now we'll say, how does that stem? Because Rava holds, Yadayim she'inan mochichos, lo havyon yadayim. The Rabbanon are the ones who said by get that all you need is what? Hari'at mutaras l'chol, which would seem to indicate that they hold Yadayim she'inan mochichos, havyon yadayim. To which the Gemara says, Ad kan lo kamri Rabbanon de lo ba'ini yadayim mochichos elagabe get. Now also remember again, we had this in yesterday's daf. This was the top of Vav, top of this very daf. So remember again, Rava said like this, the only reason why the Rabbanon don't need Yadayim Mochichos, why the Rabbanon are okay with a little bit of ambiguity in a get is why? De'in adam megarish es eishes chavero. I will say for one simple reason. Everyone knows who's you're divorcing. For the simple reason you can only divorce your wife, right? You can't divorce someone else's wife, right? So lemaisa, even a little bit of ambiguity. I will say, by the way, let's just go back for just a moment. You'll ask yourself, I don't understand, if he's writing in the get, Hari'at muteres l'chol adam, where's the ambiguity? Right? Where's the ambiguity? So also remember again, the Ran explained that the ambiguity is maybe it's not the get that's the vehicle for divorce. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's deeper. Maybe it's words. But in any event, the point that the Gemara is making is Rava says the Rabbanon allow a little bit of ambiguity in the actual writing of the get. Why? Because the process itself is so explicitly clear. Right? There's only one person who you could possibly be divorcing. So even if the wording is not as explicit as it could be, we're not worried about any ambiguity in the process. Aval ba'alma ba'iran yadayim mochichos. But in general, Rava says, even the Rabbanon would agree outside of Gittin that you would require yadayim mochichos. Good. Shabbosai. So let's pause here for just a moment. So what did we just do on Amud Aleph? What did we just try to accomplish? What we just tried to accomplish is, remember, we have our machlokes Abaye and Rava. That's our overarching machlokes. Yadayim she'enan mochichos. Ambiguous or inexplicit yad, does it work to affect a neder or not? Abaye, yes. Rava, no. This whole Amid was trying to go ahead and lob questions at Abaye to try to derail or disprove his position. The Gemara was unsuccessful. We did not successfully disprove Abaye. Good. So now what we're left with, Rabbi say, is still this machlokes Abaye and Rava. Parallel to that, we have another machlokes. What's the other machlokes? Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon. By Gittin. Right? How explicit do you have to be in a get? Rabbanon, not so explicit. It just has to say, Hari'at mutaras l'chol adam. Right? Rabbi Yehuda, it has to be much more explicit. You have to write this get, there's a book of divorce, a book of this, a book of good. Fine. So Rabbi say, now just as an aside, does this machlokes, Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon, align up with Abaye and Rava? That's machlokes itself as well. Two different versions as to whether or not it lines up. So we're still left now with our fundamental machlokes, Yadayim she'enan mochichos, hav yadayim or lo hav yadayim. I will say, now the truth is, I spoiled it for you a little bit yesterday, because at the end of yesterday's daf, we did the Rambam, and I showed you that how does the Rambam paskin? The Rambam holds, Yadayim she'enan mochichos, lo havyon yadayim. That's how the Rambam paskins. The Rambam paskins like Rava, that in order for yad to work, there has to be some level of explicit kite associated with it, right? It has to be some level of explicit understanding. Now, what level of explicit understanding is still going to remain subject to some level of machlokes, but ultimately, halacha l'maisa, we paskin like Rava. Again, hold that in the back of your mind. And we'll say some great cases. Now, watch this. Amud Beis. Watch this. Bayra Papa. This is great. Yesh yad l'kiddushin olo. We'll say, does a yad work for kiddushin or not? Can you use a partial declaration for kiddushin or not? So watch this. Take a look at the top Ran, right? Ran Vav Amud Beis, right hand side. So Bayra Papa Yesh yad l'kiddushin, right? Afilu biyad mochiach kami bale. And I both say, now the truth is, this question is even with a yad mochiach, right? We're transitioning a little bit because we're going now from a discussion about yadayim she'inan mochichos back to just a general discussion about a yad. So can you use a partial declaration, a yad, to affect kiddushin? So look at the Ran. So mi amrinan nihi delo israbu luhu yados b'adjia gamrina mamatzino min nedarim o ein yad v'afilu muchach de nedarim. I'm sorry, v'afilu mochiach. So we'll say here, according to the Ran, here's the fundamental shaila. We're not asking a yadayim shena mochichos. Even a regular yad, an explicit yad, what we call a yad mochiach, an explicit yad. Can you use a yad to affect kiddushin? Well, we'll say, what's the shaila? So what we're really asking is, does the concept of a partial declaration apply to kiddushin or not? Or is this simply something found by what? By Nedarim. By Nedarim. He says, the Nedarim shaini, the chamiri, dafilu b'dibura ba'al machayli, ma she'in kein b'kiddushin, she'in tzrichin eza maisa kesef o shtar o bia. So we'll say, this is so fascinating. Listen to this shaila. So we'll say, there's a fundamental question. Does the concept of a yad, of a partial declaration, work by kiddushin? Now, what's the shaila? On one hand, do we say that maybe the concept of a yad is dafka concept by nedarim? Because remember again, how do you affect a neder? How do you affect a neder? Dibur. So by nedarim, which are affected by dibur, ultimately, again, that's where yad comes in. But kiddushin, Rabosai, part of kiddushin is affected by dibur, right? But the truth is, kiddushin always needs some type of follow-up process as well. Kesef, money, shtar, a document, bia, relations. So dibur by itself by kiddushin is never enough. So maybe, since dibur is never enough by kiddushin, but you both say you do need some type of dibur, right? Because remember again, without the dibur, well, I take that back. We're assuming you need some type of dibur, because without the dibur, how are you framing the rest of the process, right? A man gives a woman money, right? He gives her $10. Silence, right? Okay, what was? Oh, it must be Kesef Kiddush. No, or again, there has to be some type of dibur that frames the process, right? Without dibur, I don't know what's happening over here. So let's hear the shaila. So does a yad work for kiddushin or not? And again, yad mochiach, right? An explicit yad. Does it work? So the Gemara says, "Sehechi dami." That's great. What's the case? So exciting. What's the case? Ilema da amar yeshla. Sorry, hechi dami. Ilema. Da'amar la li'isha hari'at mikudeshes li. Let's listen to this. Maybe he goes over to Rachel, right? Reuben goes over to Rachel and he says, hari'at mikudeshes li. Ba'amar lechaverta, and Rachel happens to be standing next to her friend Leah, and he says to Leah, va'at nami. You too. He's a keeper, right? You too, right? So Rachel hari'at mikudeshes li, Leah va'at nami. You know what? All right, fine. We're in a good mood today, right? You too. So we'll say, so the Gemara says, Pshita, Hainu Kiddushin Atzman. That for sure works, because that's Kiddushin. I will say, now we have to put a little bit more, meat on the bones with this framework. Look at the Ran. The Ran says, we'll say right across, in the first short line, D'amar lo li'isha hari'at mikudeshes, v'nosan la shtei prutos. Okay. So now we'll say, the Ran's filling out this case a little bit. See, here we go. Right, so Reuven goes over to Rachel. Right? Rachel and Leah standing next to each other. So Reuven goes over to Rachel. He says to Rachel, and he gives her two prutos. He says to Rachel, Hari'at mikudeshes li. Okay, beautiful. And then what happens? Then he turns to Leah, and he says, Leah, va'at nami. You're also mikudeshes to me. So the Gemara says, right? So if you look, if you look at the next round, so the Gemara says this case certainly works. Why does it work? And both say, of course, we're assuming over here that halacha l'maisa, Rachel and Leah want to marry Reuven, right? Obviously, you can't marry a woman against her will, right? So Lemaisa again, Reuven's going over to Rachel, gives her two prutos, right? He goes and he says to her, Hari'at mikudeshes li, right? And then he turns to Leah and he says to her, Va'at nami, and you too. So the Gemara says that works. Now, why does it work? Because we will say, listen to this. Rachel received two prutos. We assume that what happened over here, one of those prutos is for Rachel, and the other pruta, she was mekabel for Leah as Leah's shaliach. Assuming that Leah consents to the marriage, we view it as Rachel being the shaliach, the agent to receive. Assuming that Leah consents to the marriage, we view Rachel ultimately again as being the shaliach to receive the kesef kiddushin for Leah. Beautiful, beautiful. That's what the Ran is highlighting over here. So v'chi amra dinei chale havi mikudeshes the chaverta kabla bishlichusa. Bishlichusa. Good. So the Gemara said, now the Ran just goes on. He says it can't be a case of where Reuven is actually giving a pruta to both Rachel and to Leah. The Ran says why? Because I will say in that case there's no shaila. There's no shaila. In other words, right? If he gives a pruta to Rachel, he says Hariat Nekudesh Li, and then gives another pruta to Leah and says V'gam at, right? That's obvious. That's obvious. There's nothing to talk about in that case. The little bit of chiddush in this case is he's giving two prutos to Rachel, right? Giving two prutos to Rachel. Hariat Mikudeshes Li, says Rachel, you're Mikudeshes to me, and then he turns to Leah and he says Va'at Nami, you too. So we'll say again, assuming that both women consent, halacha l'maisa. Ultimately, it works. Back to the Gemara. Pshita, hainu kiddushin atzman. That's kiddushin. That's kiddushin. So we'll say, that can't be the case. In other words, that can't be the question. So we'll say, so again, now I want to point out, so we'll say, where's the yad in this case? Where's the yad? Where's the yad? Va'at nami. Va'at nami. Right? That is a shortened form, an abridged form. So va'at nami, right? We'll say, but that's obvious that it works. So what's the question? El is incredible. Elikigon da amar la liisha hariat nikudeshes li va'amar la lechaverta va'at. Oh, interesting. I would say. See, here's the case. Says the Gemara. Reuven goes over to Rachel, gives Rachel two prutos. He says to Rachel, hariat mikudeshes li, right? And then he turns to Leah and he says, and you. Again, marriage was different back then. I was right? And you, right? And you. So we'll say, so now here's the shaila. What does and you mean? So the Gemara says, Miyan minan, vi'at nami amar la lechaverta, v'tafsi ba kiddushin lechaverta. Is he saying to Leah, the same way that I was mekadesh Rachel, I want to be mekadesh you? And assuming that Leah, of course, is willing, that halacha l'maaseh kiddushin has been affected, O Dilma, va'at chozoi amar la lechaverta, v'lo tafsi ba kiddushin bechaverta. Or maybe what Reuven is saying is like this. When he says to Rachel, hariat mikudeshes li, Reuven's being mekadesh Rachel. When he says to Leah, va'at, what is he saying to her? Leah, would you consider getting married to me as well? It's not a proposal. No, proposal is the wrong word. In other words, it's not kiddushin. What he's doing is he's floating the idea. Right? He's floating the idea. Right? Would you consider marriage to me? But it's not kiddushin. So I will say, so this is interesting. So now I will say, this Gemara says, this is the case of yesh yad likiddushin olo. Now I will say, it turns out that this is also a shtickle like yad she'ena mochiach, it turns out to be, right? So this is a partial declaration, and we're just not sure. So again, two cases. Reuven goes to Rachel, hariat mikudeshes li, gives her two prutos, right? And ultimately then turns to Leah and says, va'at nami, and you two is explicit. Assuming that both women are willing. Ultimately, again, he's mekadesh both of them. What's the shaila of yeshad l'kiddushin? Goes over to Rachel, two prutos, hariat mikudeshes li, turns to Leah, va'at, and you. What does and you mean? Does and you mean, and I also want to do kiddushin with you? Or va'at perhaps means what? I would like you to consider the possibility of us getting married in the future. Incredible. So the Gemara says, 1 second. So we'll say this is Rav Papa Shaila. Great case, no? Great case. So Mimi Baile, so we'll say, did Rav Papa really have this Shaila? So the Mimi Baile the Rav Papa, Vahami the Amrle Rav Papa la Abaye. But Rav Papa said to Abaye, both in a different context, right? The Gemara is quoting over Mesechus Kiddushin. Rav Papa quoting to Abaye, Misa v'Shmuel Yadayim she'ena mochichos havya Yadayim. Right? The Shmuel hold that Yadayim she'ena mochichos are not Yadayim. Michlal the Svira leil Rav Papa the Yesh Yad the Kiddushin. See, what's interesting as follows. Rav Papa was asking in Kiddushin about Yadayim she'ein al mochichos, which sounds like that Rav Papa took it for granted that a Yad Mochiach does work by Kiddushin. Does work by Kiddushin. To which Rabbi says, so what's the Shaila over here? To which the Gemara says, no. So the Gemara says, this really Rav Papa diyesha the Kiddushin. Chada migo mai disfirle the Shmuel amar le Abaye. No. Rav Papa was just kind of making an assumption about what he thought was the position of Shmuel and was asking that kasha to Abaye. Rabbi says, if you look at Rashi for just a moment, sorry, I mean the Ran. The Ran says, migo mai disfirle amar le Abaye. Then he Rav Papa mesapkale to dilma enyad the Kiddushin klal. Rav Papa himself is not sure if yados work by Kiddushin in general. That's his shaila. Miha lo matzila kshui ela de Shmuel de dilma iu svirle de yesh yad ela actually didei adidei. So Rabbi say Rav Papa himself is unsure if a yad works by Kiddushin at all. But he was at least asking Shmuel. He thought Shmuel held that a yad does work. So in Shmuel he was asking, does a yad she'ena mochiach work? Okay, I will say, bottom line, the Gemara leaves this open. We're going to see a series of questions like this that are left open-ended, right? We're not going to resolve them one by one. We're going to resolve them at the end. So I will say, so question number one that now we have to deal with, that's an open question is, yesh yad l'kiddushin o ein yad l'kiddushin? Do partial declarations work for kiddushin or not? Open question. Next. By Rav Papa. It's great. Yesh yad l'peya o ein yad l'peya? Fascinating. Does a partial declaration work for peya or not? So let's remember again, what's the halach with peya? Peya is the obligation to leave a corner or a section of your field for the poor. So does a partial declaration work for peya or not? Now what's the case? Hechi dami, what's the case? Ilema de amar hadein ugya lehavi peya vadein nami. So the Gemara says, if we're talking about a case like this, I go into my field and I say this ugya rabosei literally is a row. I say this row of produce should be peya. And then what? And I say, Vadeinami, and that row also. Now, both say that's a partial declaration, but the Gemara says that's pashut, right? You say that row also. Both say that's not even a yad. That's an explicit statement. Hahi peya ma'al yosehi. That's obvious. That's obvious at the end of the day that's peya. So the Gemara says, actually, before we go on, let me just show you. If you look in the third wide line in the Ran, by Rav Papa yesh yad l'peya. So we'll say, I want to point out, what's the shaila here? What's the shaila? He says, kilomar, in tim salomar, bikidushin ein yad delo iskish l'nedarim klal, peya de iskish mai. So we'll say, let's go take a step back for just a moment. What was the ikr question by kiddushin? If you remember again, the Gemara, Rav Papa introduced us to the idea of yesh yad l'kiddushin olo. Remember again, how did the Ran frame the ikr question? What's the ikr question? The ikr question is, I will say, the concept of yad comes from where? Where does the concept of yad come from? Little Chazara? Nazir, excellent, right? From Nazir lahazir, right? Then remember the progression. How does it progress? Once it applies to Nazir, we could apply it where? Nedarim. Why? Neder is mentioned in the same exact pasuk. So the concept of the yad is really by Nazirus and Nedarim. So the question the Gemara was really asking over here was, halacha l'maisa, can you go ahead and apply ultimately again the concept of yad to kiddushin, which has nothing to do with Nedarim and Nazirus. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. We're going to see now the Gemara is by peya. Now peya does have a connection to Nedarim. Now we don't know what that connection is yet. Stay tuned. But in Meretz Hashem peya, which does have a connection, does a yad work for peya? Okay, so now that's the backdrop. So Rabbi says, so now, okay, what's the case? So if I'm walking into a field, and I say this row should be peya, and also this one, that's not a yad. That's an explicit statement. So what's the case? Ki kami ba'ilei, ki gon da amar v'hadein v'lo amar nami. Oh, Rabbi say, what's the case? I go into my field. I say this row should be peya, v'hadein, and this one. As opposed to, remember again, the first case was v'hadein nami, and also this one. Also, this one clearly makes the second row into peya as well. What about if I say this row is peya, v'hadein, and this one, but not and this one also, just and this one? What's the halacha? V'hadein, v'lo amar nami. I didn't say also. So what's the halacha? To which the Gemara says, Michlal, Di amar sadeh kula tehavi peya. To which the Gemara says, so I'm sorry, the Amar I'm sorry, Michlal, Dechi Amar Sadeh Kula Tehavi Peya Havi Peya. And I will say, the Gemara just makes an interesting observation about this, right? I sounds like from here that you can make as much of your field peya as you want to, right? What happens if I decide I want to make my entire field peya? It sounds like that such a setup should actually work. To which the Gemara says, yes, that does work. Vatanya, Minayishim wrote Lasos Kol Sadeo Peya Oseh. How do we know that if you want to make your entire field into peya, you have the ability to do so? Talmud Lomar Pa'as Sadcha. Pasuk says Pa'as Sadcha. It's interesting. The way the Gemara darshans is Pas Sadcha means a corner of your field. The way the Gemara is darshaning it over here is in peya, you have different options. What are your different options? Pas, which means a corner, or what's your second option? Sadcha. And what does Sadcha mean? If you want to make your whole field peya, you have the ability. So by the way, what's the chiddush in that? The chiddush in that is that peya is a form of tzedakah. Normally, tzedakah, we learned this before, has certain caps. You would have thought that perhaps peya has a cap as well. Kamash malon, it does not. You can make your entire field peya should you choose. Okay, so we'll say, so now here's the shaila. To which the Gemara says, Miyamrinon, kevan de iskish lekarbanos. Oh, so here we go, Bosai. So do we say that since peya is compared to karbanos, which we will see, since peya is compared to karbanos, ma karbanos yesh lahem yad, just like the concept of yad ultimately goes ahead and works by a carbon. So therefore, again, af peya yesh la yad, so too peya has a yad as well. And therefore, Abosai, when I walk into my field and I say this row should go ahead and be peya, and this one, v'gam, right? Vizu. Oh, what was lashon? V'hadein, and this one. But I don't say nami. I don't say also. That should work. Just like yad works by carbon, yad works by peya. Oh, Dilma, no. Ki iskish labal ta'acheru iskish. No, that's not true. The comparison between peya and carbon. Rabbi say, we don't know what the comparison. You didn't miss it. We didn't do it yet. So the Gemara says, or maybe the comparison between peya and carbon is not to tell me that yad works. Rather, Rabbi say, what is it to teach me? That the same way that a carbon is subject to the prohibition of bal ta'acher. That once you pledge to make a carbon, you cannot delay it. So to what? Halacha l'maisa, when going ahead and designating peya, you can't delay peya either. So I'll say, so now I begin to understand what's happening. Why is there even a havamina that yad should work by peya? Why is there even a havamina? Because peya is compared to carbon. And just like by carbonos a yad works, so too I would think that maybe by peya a yad works. Or maybe no, maybe the comparison between carbonos and peya is going to tell me that just like a carbon is subject to bal ta'acher, peya, if you delay designating the corner of your field for the aniyim, that is subject to bal ta'acher as well. To which the Gemara says, by the way, v'hecha iskish, where is that? Right? Where is peya compared to carbon? I will say, here we go. The Sanya, the Gemara quotes the pasuk. The Sanya, quoting over here, Kisidar nedar Hashem l'kecha. I'm showing you the whole pasuk. Kisidar nedar Hashem l'kecha lo sa'acher l'shalmo. When you make a neder to Hashem, do not delay in going and fulfilling it. Why? Ki darosh yidrshenu Hashem l'kecha me'imach v'haya b'cha chet. Because Hashem will go ahead and literally seek it out. Hashem will seek it out from you. So the Gemara says, me'imach ze leket shechacha upeya. That was very interesting. So what happens? Me'imach, this refers to leket, shechacha, and peya. So both say, I just want to point out, the Gemara's understanding over here, when the Torah says, ki sidor neder la Hashem, the neder that we're talking about is often a carbonic neder. I've made a neder to bring a carbon. So the Torah says that when you go, so you see in the same pasuk, we're mentioning carbon, and ultimately we're mentioning peya. So if Rabbi say, this is the source of the question. Now that I know that peya is compared to carbon, do I say that just like carbon, yad works, so too peya, yad works, and therefore let's play this forward. And therefore, when I walk into my field, and I say, this row should be peya, and then what? And then I say what? And say what? And this one, that should work, or maybe not. The carbon peya comparison only works to do what? Halacha l'maisa, go ahead and make it subject to bal ta'acher, but does not work for yad. Rabosai, the Gemara leaves this question open. So second open-ended question, we're going to stop over here for today. But this is a second question the Gemara leaves off with. So now we have two open-ended questions. Question number one is ultimately, does Yad work by Kiddushin? Question number two, does Yad work by Peah? We have another incredible question. We'll say tomorrow the sugya begins with tzedakah, which is an absolutely wild case in Meretz Hashem, incredible case. We're going to have three open-ended questions. We'll solve them all in Meretz Hashem Halacha L'Maisa. Incredible Gemara tomorrow. We'll say shkoyach. All right, have a great day. Everyone on Zoom. Good to see everyone.